It's good.
Great. Well, so this is a part 3, and I'm going to actually dive right into this slideshow. And it's been a little while since we were all together. So what I can tell you is we left off just before 1967. So I'm going to dive in and hopefully we'll have some time for conversation. Here comes a little screen share. Okay. Well, as you probably know, there was in 1967 a war that lasted just under a week, pitting Israel on one side against the combined armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan on the other, along with some Palestinian militia. And the war ended in a massive triumph for Israel and in a devastating defeat for the Arab coalition. So before offering up two different narratives on 1967, because that's what I'm doing throughout this process is, right, offering a Zionist classic narrative and then giving my best shot at a Palestinian classic narrative with the repeated disclaimer that whenever you're trying to present a whole nother group's narrative and you're not a part of that group, just be aware that I'm more likely to get stuff wrong in that ballpark, and please look for multiple sources of information on everything that I might say today. That said, I just want to mention sort of a few big picture overview points about this war. So one thing is just to mention that this is right in the midst of the Cold War, and that's a whole nother overlay on what's happening in the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in 1967, most of the Arab nation states were allied with the USSR. In the lead up to this war, there were some big picture things that were going on. The nation of Egypt was headed by President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was also really seen by many in the region as kind of the primary spokesperson for pan-Arab nationalism. Pan-Arab nationalism, we talked about the beginnings of Arab nationalism during this first session when we were looking at the early 20th century and World War I, the desire of people living in what would become modern Arab nation states after World War I, the desire of people living there to throw off colonial overlords, whether they were European or Turkish. So that movement for liberation and for nationalism took on various forms. One of the forms that it took that continued to really dominate a lot of the discourse in the 1960s was pan-Arab nationalism, and this idea that Arab nation states and Arabs as a cohesive religious and ethnic set of peoples had shared interest in a national liberation project. And without getting into the details of what that would ultimately mean in terms of where boundaries would get drawn and who would be in charge of whom, Nasser was very much seen as a global spokesperson for that movement. And at this point, the USSR had determined that this was where they wanted to cast most of their lot. And so there were a number of different flashpoints, and I'm not going to unpack them all here, nor am I trying to suggest who started what that led to what. The main pieces I just want to mention as points of fact is that at a certain point, Nasser makes a decision to close some strategic waterways that the Israelis at that point felt they wouldn't be able to function economically if they did not regain access to. So that ratcheted up tension a lot. And um, there was a mobilization of troops, especially on the part of Egypt, in the run-up just before 1967. And the Israelis also were on several occasions doing mass mobilization of troops or bringing troops to either the Syrian border or the Egyptian border. So you've got the different parties seeing a lot of activity and trying to interpret who's planning to do what. And all of this is leading to tensions mounting. And ultimately, and we'll see in the two narratives that once we get into them, how disputed all of this is in terms of who did what to whom and who started what. But ultimately, the Israelis launched a strike against Egypt's Air Force. That was the military blow that started the war. The Israelis term it a preemptive strike. The Egyptians felt that it was a wanton act of aggression. But that proved quite decisive. Most of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground. And as a result, the war didn't last very long, and Israel ended up taking territory from 3 different countries. So if you see the map in the upper right-hand corner, the orange area was the territory that Israel ruled just before the war started. And then by the time the war was over, you can see these other areas in orange were all areas that Israel had conquered. It had conquered the Sinai Desert, which Egypt had controlled, as well as the Gaza Strip, which Egypt had also controlled, but had less of a clear long-term interest in. It had conquered the West Bank, which had been under Jordanian rule since 1948, as well as the Golan Heights. It's hard to see on this map, but this is an elevated area. And in the years before guided missiles and rockets became a major part of military arsenals, the high ground remained an incredibly important militarily strategic thing to possess. So this ended up being a chunk of land that the Israelis held on to after the war and were very loath to give up. So one more thing before we get into the two narratives. We haven't spent much time talking about the role that the Cold War played in this conflict. And as you can imagine, there are shelves worth of books on that topic, and I will not try to cover it. It is vast. But there's one thread that I want to share, partly because it's poorly known, and partly because it illustrates how the agendas of superpowers sometimes distorted and redirected the parties involved on the ground. So in the spring of 1967, the Soviet Union had Egypt and other Arab states as allies and provided them with advanced weapons and equipment and training. The United States at this time was much closer to Israel than it had been at any point to date, but the tight US-Israel alliance that we are used to had not formed yet. The US still had very serious interests in maintaining good relationships with oil-producing Arab states, and it was inclined to act to keep Israel afloat, but to maintain a bit of distance so as to stay on good terms with the Saudis and some of their neighbors primarily. It would be fair to say that during this period, the US and the Soviets had taken sides, but they had not cemented their positions. And they both had incentives to keep their options somewhat flexible. So now I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a story that is actually intensely disputed. But I'm going to tell the story anyway. And then I'm going to remind you that it's disputed. So in the Kremlin, the leaders decided in the mid-60s that they could improve their strategic position throughout the region if Egypt and Syria could do battle with Israel, inflict serious damage, and then come to a ceasefire that would achieve three goals. One, display the superior awesomeness of Soviet weapon systems. Two, make the Soviets heroes to Arab leaders throughout the region. And three, degrade the Israelis' ability to project power and Western influence in the region. The problem that the Soviets had was that Egypt and Syria's leaders weren't confident that they were ready for a new round of fighting with Israel. And Israel wasn't exactly eager for a multi-front, risky new war. So, according to some historians, the Soviets decided to use disinformation to coax the parties into what they hoped would be a limited war that they could then leverage to their strategic advantage. So here's how, according to some Soviet historians, this played out. This is 1967. On the 13th of May, the Soviet Union delivers a warning to the Egyptian government that Israel is massing brigades on the Syrian border and is about to attack. The next day, Egypt's leader masses troops in the Sinai to deter the Israelis attacking on the Syrian front, and then begins a very intense series of bellicose speeches on radio and TV. Later that day, the top Egyptian military official in Syria sends urgent word to President Nasser that there are no Israeli troops there. But over the course of the next several days, Soviet newspapers continue to falsely report that Israel is amassing troops on the Syrian border and is imminently going to attack. Bear in mind, there's no internet, there's barely any satellites, right? It's not a thing where the Egyptians or the Israelis can ask the Americans or anybody else, well, what are you seeing from outer space? You still actually needed sort of credible eyewitnesses to be able to relay intelligence over a phone line. So on the 22nd of May, Nasser, who by now is no longer certain what is actually happening, but is becoming more and more alarmed, and he knows someone's double crossing him, but he doesn't know who. Is it his person on the ground in Syria? Is it the Russians? Is it the Israelis? Is it the Syrians? Is it the Americans? So he makes a bold move and closes off this waterway. The USSR continues to feed Nasser false intel, but orders him not to strike first, and stresses the importance of the Israelis striking first. In Israel, meanwhile, what's happening, and I haven't really described this, is there's all these things that are happening that the Israeli military people are seeing the Egyptians and the Syrians do. So they're panicking, and they are doing multiple sudden reservist call-ups. So in Israel, the deal was, and it kind of still is today, but it was even more so then, how is a war going to work out? The way a war is going to work out for us is we do a massive sudden reservist call-up. So it's a mobilization of a huge portion of the entire population. And it's people scrambling to grab their boots out of their closets and report somewhere and get ready for combat. So every time the Israeli government does this throughout the last 2.5 weeks of May, first of all, it's enormously expensive. And 67, Israel's more of a third world economy than a first world. It's incredibly draining and demoralizing psychologically. And it creates this mounting pressure on the Israeli government to just strike and get this over with. So the government collapses. A national emergency government forms. And at this point, the Israelis are convinced that they're about to be in the war of all wars, and they begin producing massive number of coffins, preparing for a high casualty war. And then as this drama continues, then they launch the war on June 5th. Now, if you are now feeling angry towards the former Soviet Union after hearing all of this, at the sort of the callousness of treating human beings like pawns, and of course, using radical disinformation to make everybody confused about what's real, which is not a new tool in Russian intelligence tool bag, then that is understandable. But I have to tell you to hold off for a moment, because the portrait of events that I just painted is heavily disputed. There are historians who contradict the narrative that the Soviets went around misleading their allies and deliberately tried to start this war. It is that difficulty getting to some kind of agreement about basic facts that comes up over and over again with this conflict. And at every level, whether it's sort of the level of what happened on the ground in one particular border area or village, or whether it's on the level of Israel and Palestine, or whether it's on the meta level of large global powers involved with their own agendas. And that's one of the really hard things about this conflict. And that's not to say that it's hopeless, that it's impossible to discern it, that anything's happened. Some of the bullet points here are things we know really happened. Okay, so I just wanted to include that because we've just sort of left the whole Cold War thing out of it. And there's this constant churn coming from the agendas and communication and misdirection and direction of both the American and Western bloc and the Soviets and their bloc. And that is a constant throughout this whole thing until it isn't, until the Soviet Union is no more. And then the dynamics change. So as you might guess, there are two starkly different narratives of this war. The Zionist narrative says that the Arabs started the war by amassing troops along Israel's borders and pretending repeatedly to launch invasions, by defying UN brokered agreements to keep troops away from the Israeli borders, and by blocking Israeli shipping access to key waterways. In the Israeli narrative of this, heavy emphasis on Arab leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser's bellicose public statements, TV and radio broadcasts, repeatedly talking about using the language of, this is where a lot of the language of we're going to drive them into the sea, we're going to wipe them out, we're going to flatten them. This is where a lot of that rhetoric ends up being broadcast out and absorbed by Israelis. Israel's fragile economy and citizen reserve-based army was becoming more and more stressed out by repeated "get ready to deploy, we think the invasion is coming any day" orders being sent out to reservists, leaving Israelis in their narrative with no choice but to save themselves by launching a preemptive strike. And then as the narrative goes, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, and facing the possibility of total annihilation by the Arabs, the Israelis triumphed in a victory for the ages. And I'm just showing these images as ways in which the Israeli narrative um, dazzled the Western world and was heavily reported on and heavily celebrated. Um, and it's a narrative that amplified resoundingly through Jewish communities throughout the world as well. For Israelis, and importantly for Jews in North America as well, the Six-Day War ignited a sense of admiration, wonder, and pride. As one Johnson administration official put it, Israel at war destroys the prototype of the pale, scrawny Jew. The soldiers I saw were tough, muscular, and sunburned. There is also an extraordinary combination of discipline and democracy among officers and enlisted men. The latter rarely salute and frequently argue, but there is no doubt about who will prevail. So, and again, and I'm not offering these up to suggest callously like this is just sort of Hollywood image making. I'm saying this is the narrative that these events triggered and inspired in Israeli consciousness, and that the West received and identified with, and that the Jewish community in diaspora identified with. For Jews around the world, a new iconic photographic image was added to the one that we looked at in the very first installment of this presentation. As the contemporary center-right Israeli writer, Rabbi Daniel Gordis, once observed, the two images you're seeing are two images that are deep in the Israeli psyche, in the public consciousness. And I would add in much of the larger Jewish psyche. So again, on the left, the image we saw before, a famous image, a helpless little boy surrendering to Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto. On the right, a famous photograph of some of the first Israeli soldiers to arrive at the newly captured Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, which had until then been under Jordanian control. The impact of the Six-Day War was, for Jews, intoxicating, euphoric, and confidence building. And I say for Jews around the world. The Israelis quickly shipped captured Soviet military equipment to the US as a gesture they hoped would lead to a much closer relationship, opening the door for what would soon become the US's heavy military and economic investment in Israel. The victory also appeared to put Israel's government in the driver's seat regarding the potential for trading newly captured land for diplomatic recognition, peace, and security in the region. It also set the stage for the now half-century-long Israeli occupation of the two areas in green on this map, the West Bank and Gaza. Okay, might want to loosen your neck up for some whiplash. So, of course, there is another narrative about 1967. The Palestinian narrative says that the Israelis started the war with a surprise attack on Egypt's parked jet fighter planes, and that this was part of a grander strategy to leverage several military advantages that the Israelis had at the time as part of a gambit to expand their territory. The Israelis had, after all, in 1956, joined forces with the French and British in an unprovoked attack attempting to seize the Suez Canal by force. An attack which failed and resulted in an Egyptian triumph, by the way, but which exposed the Israeli desire to conquer and control more and more Arab lands and its readiness to join forces, and this is crucial, with European colonial powers, proving the argument that Israel's essential identity was that of a European colonial infiltrator. In the Palestinian narrative, For Palestinians and most people in the Arab world, the June 67 war was an act of naked aggression and conquest, revealing Israel's true colors as a Western colonial outpost seeking to expand its power. Israel showed its true colors in one way in particular by almost immediately beginning to build new settlements in these larger conquered territories that you see on the map here, not just the West Bank and Gaza, but even down in the Sinai Desert. A flagrant violation of international law. So as we've seen before, these narratives disagree on crucial facts and on who is the righteous victim and who is the cruel aggressor. The War of 1967 is known as Al-Naqsa, the Great Setback to Palestinians. During the course of the war, somewhere between 280,000 and 400,000 more Palestinians fled, were expelled, or were otherwise uprooted from their homes. And many more villages were razed by the Israelis. Refugee camps in neighboring states swelled. Almost as soon as the dust from the war had settled, Israel began authorizing new settlements in the captured territories, beginning an expansion that has continued to this day. The refugee population grew, as did the number of refugee camps. A new situation arose in which Israel now controlled a major Palestinian population living under its military authority, including refugee camps in the occupied territories that dated back to the Nakba in 1948, as well as towns and villages throughout these lands. For Palestinians, the losses of 1967 were an extension of the losses and dispossessions they faced in 1948, and their goals remained largely the same: to win back the right to their lands and homes throughout Palestine, even as the larger state actors in the region, like Egypt and Syria, pursued agendas that sometimes aligned with the Palestinian plight and sometimes did not. The military failure of the coalition of Arab armies that fought in the June War of 1967 led many Palestinian activists to conclude that they could not rely on other Arab forces to win them back their homes and their lands. And organizations like the PLO rose to greater prominence with a formidable base of power and paramilitary training camps at this point in time located largely in Jordan. So now comes the part of my presentation where I give horribly short attention to a lot of watershed events because of the time limits and the importance of making sure there's a chance for us to explore some of the possibilities for the future of Israel and Palestine. So what I would like to suggest is that the dual narrative approach I've tried to present through all three of these sessions serve as a method that all of us try to use whenever we seek to learn about any particular chapter of this bitter and unresolved conflict. So let the absurdly brief leapfrogging through several decades begin with a few mentions of events in the 1970s and 80s. So before I get into these two narratives, here are a few key moments from the 70s. As you know, as I'm sure everybody knows, in 1973, there was another major war in the Middle East. This time, it was known as the October War in the Arab world, or the Yom Kippur War to Israelis. Syria and Egypt, now led by Anwar Sadat, launch a surprise attack, and it is initially extremely successful, and they nearly defeat Israel in this war, though by the end of the war, the Israelis were able to push the Syrian and Egyptian forces back to where they started, and it all ended up in the same place in terms of where ceasefire lines were as they had been before. However, there was an increase in Arab pride because it was clear that that the Israelis as a society had experienced the war as a disaster, as one of terrible losses, and one in which they felt that they had gotten through it by the skin of their teeth. So in the aftermath of this war, which, by the way, then President Sadat of Egypt had a fairly certain notion was not going to end in Israel being overrun and occupied by Egyptian and Syrian forces. Most historians say that his papers and memos indicate that he knew that at the end of the day, this would be a stalemate. But his goal was to inflict a terrifying and devastating temporary victory, in part to reposition his government to appear more palatable and attractive to the United States. He had grown tired of Soviet patronage and thought his regime's fortunes might do better with the West. So Sadat actually, behind the scenes, parlays the military and strategic gains that Egypt got out of the 1973 war into a series of repeated approaches to Israel's leaders about doing a peace deal. And this culminates eventually in the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. Negotiations started in 77. The agreement gets concluded entirely in 79. And a couple of things just to note in terms of how most of the world powers and the leadership of Israel, Arab countries, and the PLO interpreted the aftermath of this peace agreement. One of the things that couldn't be missed was that Israel entered into an enduring peace agreement in which they exchanged conquered territory for peace. That may not seem like a big deal in 2021, but in 1977, people didn't know whether or not that could ever happen or would ever happen. So it was significant that it happened. It became clearly possible. Another takeaway that was not one Israelis wanted people to hold on to, but that definitely took root throughout much of the Arab world was if Israel is attacked, and really this bullet point should say, attacked with some measure of effectiveness, attacked in a way that it really is frightening and hurts, it will come to the table and make concessions. Again, these are perceptions I'm describing. I'm not saying these are truths. I'm saying this is how many world leaders and military leaders came to interpret this series of events. Finally, in Israel, one of the things this led to was a truism that has its upside and its downside. This led to a truism circulating in Israeli consciousness that it's only the hawks who make peace. Why is that? Because, as you can see in these images on the right, Sadat was seen as a hawk before he began making diplomatic maneuvers to try and go for this peace deal. And in fact, he was seen by Israelis as one of the most effective military commanders of any of their adversaries. So he's seen as a hawk. Golda Meir, who actually was a hawk, nevertheless became perceived by Israelis writ large as weak, as not having succeeded in preventing this nearly disastrous war. And she ends up resigning. And this gives way to the Likud taking power for the first time in Israel's history. And Menachem Begin, the same Menachem Begin who helped blow up the King David Hotel, who took part in a number of terrorist attacks with the Irgun against Arab civilians, becomes Israel's prime minister, and then becomes the prime minister to enter into a peace agreement in which he cedes territory. So it leads to this legacy perception that only hawks are actually the ones who will make peace. I say all of this because these truisms and aphorisms that emerge into public consciousness, they become sort of mythic truths that, whether they're actually true or not, may not be as important as the fact that they're widely believed. So just to share all of that. Again, to bring us through the 70s, this peace agreement happens, and as we'll get a chance to talk about later, this is a peace agreement that in many ways is as controversial as it is inspiring of new hope. So, let me see where we are here. Okay, believe it or not, I'm still staying kind of in my somewhat attempt at neutral overview here. I'm not going into either narrative here for the moment, but I want to talk about settlements in the aftermath of 1967. So starting in 1968, successive Israeli governments pursued a policy of incentivizing Israeli Jewish citizens to move into a number of settlements dotting the West Bank and Gaza. And while a small number of settlers were motivated by a brand new religious nationalist movement that asserted that God wanted the Jews to settle all of the biblical lands of Israel, and that the Six-Day War was won through miraculous divine intervention, most settlers were not a part of this fringe religious movement. Most of them were attracted to sweetheart deals for housing and other generous benefits that they received in exchange for being the government's eyes and ears on the ground amongst the Arab population in the West Bank and Gaza. So initially, the number of settlers was in the few thousands, but in time it has increased to over 600,000 settlers living in the West Bank today. And what began as a radical outlier religious nationalist movement in 1968 has today become the dominant religious belief system of orthodoxy in the pro-settler community, deeply immersed in the belief that it is a grave sin to give up 1 millimeter of what was biblical Israel, and that even if the Israeli army itself should try to remove settlements as part of a peace agreement, the duty of the believers in this particular flavor of Judaism is that then it would be their duty to fight the Israeli army. So let's move now into a Jewish narrative and how it relates to this period of the 70s and the 80s. From an Israeli perspective, the period from 1968 all the way till 1987 was marked by a relentless series of terrorist attacks by multiple Palestinian factions, working at times in partnership with other radical groups with a number of different agendas. Israelis became intensely security conscious and relied heavily on the bulk of their civilian-based army and their intelligence secret service to thwart terrorist plots whenever possible and to retaliate vigorously when attacks succeeded in killing Israelis. So in the Israeli narrative of this period, this is a period of a ramping up of terrorism, airplane hijackings, people bursting out with machine guns and gunning people down in the Israeli airport, consistent public and vigorous rejection by Arab leaders and Muslim leaders throughout the region of the possibility of any kind of peace agreement in which Israel exists as a functioning Jewish state. And in the Israeli narrative, this is a period of continued and ongoing existential threat. Israel's main adversary throughout this stretch is the PLO. And the PLO is either directly orchestrating or behind the scenes collaborating with other groups in launching one kind of attack after another. During the first few years of this period, Golda Meir developed a new policy called asymmetrical response. It kind of means what it sounds like. The pressure on her to respond heavy-handedly to the increase in attacks, especially attacks that killed Israeli civilians or diplomats or Israelis traveling abroad, became enormous. And she ended up authorizing a formal policy of, okay, if 3 Israeli civilians are killed in a bombing, then we are going to launch a counterattack at a PLO base. And if we kill 300 and 100 of them are civilians, well, maybe they'll stop attacking us. And so this is a very, very controversial piece of sort of unofficial, but sort of official Israeli policy that began during her administration. Of course, this is also the period, and why am I putting this in the Israeli narrative? Sorry, you'd think this would be in the Palestinian narrative, right? Because it's not a very flattering moral portrait. I'm putting it in the Israeli narrative because there's a way in which this response was, in which rank and file Israelis basically would be willing to argue with you that this is what they had to do, and would be willing to stand behind it. So I'm just telling you. In the course of all of this mix, part of what Israelis are seeing on TV, they're seeing things that are absolutely bone-chilling. So it's not just that the entire Israeli Olympic team gets taken hostage and then killed in the Olympics. It's that it happens in Germany, and it's that some of the terrorists who are hired to carry out the operation on behalf of a Palestinian liberation organization are also German. So it's that, in your face of, you guys have Holocaust trauma, well, we're going to kill your Olympic team in Germany, and we're going to have Germans be involved in doing it. Same thing with the hijacking of the Air France plane that got taken to Entebbe in Uganda. Some of the hijackers were radical Germans, right? So you've got like elderly Jews on this flight in some cases who are being held hostage by hostage takers who are speaking in German to each other and telling them that Zionism is a crime against humanity. So this kind of stuff is leading to the Israeli general public becoming ever more convinced that they have their backs up against the wall and that they are facing a hostile and uncompromisingly hateful set of enemies. Similarly, in 1975, when the United Nations passes the resolution proclaiming that Zionism is racism, what sticks out for Israelis is not that a group of nations was able to garner more votes in support of it than against it, but it's that Kurt Waldheim, a former member of the SS from Austria, is Secretary General of the UN at the time the resolution gets passed. And the optics of that for Israelis are the beginning of Israelis' conviction that the UN is out to get them. And of course, the Iranian Revolution shockwave throughout Israeli society. This was like the one Islamic country that Israelis had a warm and close relationship with. And all of a sudden that flipped around on its head. It cut off their primary supplier of oil. And suddenly they had a whole different kind of adversary that they really didn't completely see coming. So those are some of the trappings of that narrative. Before I get, actually, let me go back. Before I get to the Palestinian narrative, I want to say, in this Israeli narrative of this period, there's also this sense that Israelis rely, this is the narrative that's part of their civil sense of community, that Israelis rely on their own determination, on eclectic homegrown skills, engineering skills, technical skills, pull yourself up by your bootstrap skills, and that they're also good at wide scale cooperation to outfox this constant onslaught of attacks against Israelis in Israel and around the world, and sometimes against Jews. So this is an era, 70s and first part of the 80s, in which Israelis perceive themselves to be the underdogs of the region. The David to a Goliath comprised of 22 Arab states, a well-funded Palestinian network of militias determined to wipe them off the map, a Soviet propaganda machine that was now firmly invested in demonizing Zionism, an international diplomatic elite that found it fashionable to condemn Israel at the drop of a hat, and a rising radical Islamist tide epitomized by the Iranian Revolution. Again, I'm describing the Israeli narrative here. So complaints about the settlements to most Israelis during this period would be met with the rationalization that these are temporary outposts that are useful for maintaining security, and that, you know, the religious zealots, the nut jobs growing in the midst of some of the settlements, they are never going to amount to more than a fringe movement. Perhaps this whole period in the classical Zionist narrative can best be captured by the story, the mythologized story of the daring Israeli raid on Entebbe, freeing dozens of Jewish hostages from a protracted nightmare and giving Israelis a sense of their own remarkable capacity to find a way to triumph even against uncompromising odds. So as someone who grew up in the 70s and 80s, this was the Israeli narrative that I absorbed. Probably something like this familiar to lots of folks here. So now let's flip the narrative. So if we're talking about the 70s and most of the 80s, the Palestinian narrative is very, very, very different. By the time you get to the 70s, you're getting to the second and even third generation of Palestinians who've been living in refugee camps and who've developed a culture within the camps that is its own culture organized around resistance, pulling yourself up by your bootstrap, figuring out how to make a way out of no way, being prepared for the possibility of having to relocate at the drop of a hat, learning how to make families and homes work, but also intentionally choosing not to make them feel too permanent. Because of an intensification of the determination not to give up the right to return, the right to retrieve and recover property and lands lost, in some cases by the very people themselves still alive at this time and still relatively in their prime of life, or perhaps their parents and grandparents. The new things that get added to this mix, this experience of the refugees in the 70s and 80s, is the beginnings and then the growth, the relentless growth of the Israeli occupation. This is the period in which several million Palestinians become involved in this day-to-day lived experience in which the Israeli military authorities are in charge and are implementing a legal system that is more or less based on the rules that govern militaries that are serving as a temporary occupying power. So in international law, what that looks like is military tribunals, a very, very limited set of rights for people who are living under occupation. The military is supposed to act in good faith to try to just keep things tranquil, try to tamp down conflict, but they have very wide rights to arrest without charge, to carry out perfunctory trials, to commandeer or take over people's homes, people's rooftops, people's property. And to be checking people's person and paper and controlling people's freedom of movement. So this is all growing and growing and growing in its scope and its intensity throughout the occupied territories. And at the same time, incrementally more and more Jewish settlers are coming into the territories and are moving into these ever-growing settlements, which are not governed by Israeli military authority and law. Israeli civil law reaches out like tendrils and applies to Jews living in those settlements as if they had never left Israel proper. So a two-track legal system and a dual system of legal rights begins and then just continues to grow and expand during this period for Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. In the Palestinian narrative, the violence that they're most familiar with is Israeli state terrorism. And this is the term that they would insist on. So it's not that in the Palestinian narrative, there's denial of plane hijackings and bombings. And it's not that there isn't actually in a fairly high degree of general support for what Palestinians might prefer to call guerrilla tactics as a result of not having any other kinds of hard military power, like jet planes and bombers. There's a justification narrative in the Palestinian narrative over bombing civilians and hijacking planes and engaging in acts of political theater. Call it terrorism if you want, and they may be willing to concede the word terrorism even, but it's a central feature of their narrative that when Golda Meir's policy, carried on by every prime minister afterwards, of asymmetrical retaliation, asymmetrical responses carried out when bombs are dropped on refugee camps, wiping out hundreds of people at once, that this is state terrorism. And so a big part of the Palestinian narrative organizes around cultivating long-term resistance and resilience, a cultural resolve to endure until justice. What that means as established heads of state of places like Syria and Jordan and Egypt and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Iran, those countries' leaders keep changing their alliances with the PLO, with other Palestinian factions, with the Soviets, with the Americans. And there are times when those shifting alliances are intensely frustrating to Palestinians and feel like, in some cases, open betrayal. So I'm trying to sort of paint this picture. Meanwhile, some other pieces of the Palestinian narrative, there are ongoing, during the 70s and 80s, there are these ongoing Israeli diplomatic and covert efforts taking place throughout the West Bank and Gaza to try to induce Palestinians to voluntarily leave. And the way the Israelis are governing these territories is basically they set it up so that if you're Palestinian, it's easy to leave, and if you leave, it's hard to ever come back. Right? So these are some of the pieces that are filling in this narrative. I talked about the growth of the settlement movement. I want to touch briefly on Jordan's betrayal. I mentioned earlier that the PLO was based largely in Jordan and would use Jordan as a base from which to launch military forays to attack Israelis. And eventually the Jordanian government started to feel threatened about their own regime's long-term viability. They were actually an ethnic minority governing what had become a majority Palestinian population. The royal family of Jordan are Hashemites. They wear a red keffiyeh, not a black and white keffiyeh. They are part of a different important ethnic subgroup within Arab society. And they actually are less indigenous to what is now Jordan than most of the Palestinians and refugee Palestinians who ended up living in Jordan. So they're worried that they're going to be ousted in favor of maybe the PLO. They don't like fighting. They like stability. They don't want fighting with Israel. And so the PLO's forays against Israel from their territory are bothersome. And so they end up launching a vicious attack and massacre of several thousand Palestinians in what became known as Black September of 1970. And they drive the PLO out of Jordan, and the PLO relocates to southern Lebanon. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because I'm worried about time in general. So I'm gonna move past some of the other bullet points. Oh, I did want to, I meant to flash this up. This is an example of, in the Palestinian narrative, what they would call Israeli state terrorism. Okay. Just taking a moment here to recalibrate where I am, keeping time in mind. Okay. This is, I don't mean to spend too much time here, but part of the experience in the Palestinian narrative that relates to the PLO, which of course is got its own set of controversies attached to it in Palestinian society. But for what it's worth, as the most widely recognized political and paramilitary organization in the world, seeking to represent Palestinians, the PLO's experience throughout the time I'm talking about is one of getting chased out of one place after another. So the Jordanians chased them out of Jordan in 1970. They're in Lebanon until 1982. The Israelis launch a war against the PLO in southern Lebanon in 1982 with devastating consequences for the civilian public in Lebanon. And they drive the PLO out of Lebanon. The PLO relocates to Tunisia, and they stay there actually until 1994. But at one point, the Israelis bombed their headquarters in Tunisia as well. So this is the intensity of this war between Israel and the PLO throughout this period. So now I'm going to try to pivot a little bit, and I'm still largely within the Palestinian narrative, but I'm trying to pivot us to sort of what the end game of my three presentations is, which is to try to take some of this vast amount of information and put us in a place where we can look forward a little bit. So this period, the 70s and 80s, this is the period of the growth and spread of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, as I've mentioned. The Israelis developed two separate legal systems in these territories: Israeli military law for Palestinians, Israeli civil law extended to Jewish settlers living in these territories. In order to enforce this hybridized legal arrangement and maintain security for the ever-growing settlements, over the years, Israel has set up a massive system of military checkpoints and roadblocks across the West Bank, where Palestinians have to show Israeli soldiers their papers and be subjected to security searches of their vehicles and packages and person. Because of the checkpoints, a journey that should take maybe 30 minutes from one West Bank town to another often takes a Palestinian 4 or 5 hours. So this map does not reflect the widespread and ubiquitous presence of checkpoints in the 70s and 80s. It was a far smaller number than that. This is a map reflecting checkpoints from a few years ago. But this sort of gives you a picture of sort of where this was all leading, as it was basically never halted. So another piece of this story of Palestinians living in these occupied territories is an essential piece for the Palestinian narrative is the ongoing policies that lead to home demolitions and other forms of dispossession of property of Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to name that, trust that folks know that that's a thing, and keep going. Okay. I'm now going to actually step out of the dual narrative mode for a bit, and I'm going to speak in more general terms. So 20 years of occupation, 67 to 87, finally boiled over into the first Intifada in 1987, which was a prolonged series of marches, demonstrations, general strikes, and public displays of the Palestinian flag, which was outlawed at the time, and some violence, mostly taking the form of youths throwing rocks and stones at Israeli soldiers and tanks and risking getting shot in response. In the next few years, a few very big things began to change, and these are things that set the table for the where are we now and what happens next part that I want to get to. The first was that the PLO, headed by Yasser Arafat and at this point in Tunisia, proclaims in 1988 that its political goal is to establish a political state alongside Israel. Now, it does not give up the Palestinians' right of return to their properties wherever they may be in Israel proper, but it does go on the record saying that it is willing to accept a two-state agreement with Israel. Now, at the time, most Israelis thought that this was just not real, that they just didn't mean it. The flip side of it is that the part of the Palestinian community that did not want to compromise was really upset that the PLO sort of unilaterally made these concessions. So, you know, was it real? Was it not real? It was put on paper, and it just sort of sat there until a few years later when an Israeli government decided to find out if it was real. In the meantime, the important thing to know is that in the late 80s, we see the rise of Hamas in Gaza and a few parts of the West Bank as a new political rival to the PLO. And if you are doing a double take at the printed text next to Hamas's logo, you are seeing that correctly. Hamas at the time was a religious, social service-oriented movement, political for sure, and ideologically and religiously committed to the total defeat of Israel and to the installation of a non-democratic religious Islamic regime in all of the land. But in practical terms, in 1988, Hamas did not have very much power. And Hamas was fiercely opposed to the PLO's 1988 declaration with its concessions to accepting a two-state framework for ending the conflict with Israel. Hamas also had the advantage of being good at helping ordinary people, especially in Gaza, solve problems through its social service network. And it criticized the PLO for the PLO's corruption and for the wealthy lifestyles led by many of its top officials. And it had plenty to criticize. So Israel's leaders in 1988 saw an opportunity to play the enemy of my enemy game in about as short-sighted a way as has ever been played in the history of politics. Israel quietly began a policy of supporting Hamas's growth and popularity, not realizing how incredibly foolhardy this tactic would turn out to be. So a third major change that happens after the end of the 80s is that the Israeli public was really shaken by the 1987 Intifada and voted to elect Yitzhak Rabin, who ran on a platform of pursuing vigorous negotiations with the Palestinians to try to end the conflict. That was a significant shift. The fourth major change that's happening at the end of the 70s and 80s, the Soviet Union collapses, putting an end to the Cold War dynamic that had hung over the entire conflict for decades, and abruptly leaving the PLO without its most powerful ally, the Soviet Union. And this may have also led to the PLO searching a chance to win over the one remaining superpower, the United States. Then the fifth major dramatic change in this period that sets the stage for the morass that we find ourselves in today, though it was experienced at the time as a moment of exhilaration and great hope, was the signing of the Oslo Accords, which held out the promise of ending the indignities of the occupation, and which was designed to set the stage for incremental and tangible trust building between Israel and the newly formed governmental entity called the Palestinian Authority, the PA. And even though it's not explicitly stated in the Oslo Accord that the end game was a two-state solution, it was clearly understood that that was where the Oslo Accord was pointing in the form of a final status agreement, to use its language. So people today are gravely cynical about the Oslo Accords, but they actually got off to a rather impressive start. The PLO made a dramatic homecoming and was allowed to take power in Gaza and in the city of Jericho in the first stage of implementation. Money started flowing into the region for new infrastructure projects. The Mossad began collaborating with the PLO's intelligence agency to thwart terrorist attacks, and a Palestinian police force with uniforms and guns that looked more like those of a traditional army began joint patrols with Israeli defense forces, with soldiers from both sides riding in the very same jeeps. So there was a period, 1994, 95, 96, when Oslo actually seemed pretty incredible. I want to mention that there were two core commitments to Oslo. Neither side kept them. The Israelis made a really clear commitment to stop increasing settlements and doing things with settlements that were provocative or undermining of trust building. The Palestinian Authority committed to root out and stop the use of public airways for overt incitement, for calls to people to blow themselves up and be martyrs, or to use content that was sort of classically anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, there was a fair amount of content like that that was coming out on radio and TV, out of places governed now by the Palestinian Authority. They kept saying, we're going to get to that, but it's hard to do. And just sort of couldn't quite seem to bring themselves to fully implement this particular commitment. Nevertheless, the plan for the Oslo Accords was this idea of incremental trust building. And for a good 2 to 3 years, it almost looked like the people who designed this plan were political geniuses. Instead of just that little blotch where it says Jericho and the Gaza Strip coming under full Palestinian control under the new Palestinian Authority, all of the other little brown blotches within about a year were added to Palestinian control. And then this gold area, Area B, comes online where the Palestinian Authority is administrating things civilly and the Israeli military is still in charge of security. But remember, there are these joint patrols that are happening and they're visible. People can see Israelis and Palestinians, like for example, in the image in the lower right-hand corner, doing some of this stuff together. And there's a lot of tangible changes. So if you look at the lower left, this is a picture of Gaza during 1994-95. Gaza is still a train wreck of absolute poverty and incredible overpopulation in 1994 and 95. Nevertheless, the end of the Israeli army's presence, the end of the ban on flying the Palestinian flag, the infusion of new money, of new support for small businesses, restaurants, all kinds of stuff. There's a boomlet that happens, and there's a great deal of optimism, at least among a greater proportion of both populations than at any time to date. Very quickly, the Jordanians come on board with a new peace agreement. You can see more of this overall gestalt of what I'm talking about. A mixed Israeli-Palestinian patrol force in the upper left-hand corner. The Nobel Prizes come down. You know, all of this kind of has the feel of a train that's succeeding. In fact, this is kind of horribly ironic. I vividly remember in 1994 when the US government sent the envoy George Mitchell to try to finally get Northern Ireland to resolve in a peaceful agreement. And there was a series of rash acts of violence on both sides, and it was threatening the potential success. And members from both sides of that conflict in Northern Ireland were in an interview, and I saw one of them say, you know, if the Israelis and the Palestinians can do it, how is it that we cannot? But unfortunately, within a very short time, we see the beginnings of a 2-decade-long collapse of the promise of the Oslo Agreement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what killed Oslo, but first I'm going to ask for a time check. I couldn't hear.
It's 8:20.
Oh my, so we're overtime.
Don't worry about it. Keep going.
Are we okay? Can I go for 10 more minutes?
Sure you can.
Okay, I'm going to take that as unanimous consent. Thank you, Diana. So what killed Oslo, right? People might say too much is made of the assassination of Rabin, but I don't think too much is made of the assassination of Rabin. It certainly was a major piece that revealed that Oslo didn't stand on as strong a set of foundations as maybe it should have, because it partly stood on the foundation of there being this one uniquely indispensable political figure, whom nobody else could quite, fulfill the shoes of. But there were a number of other things that led to all of this unraveling. The crazy thing that happened with the American election, the first time around, in which the person who got the lesser number of votes ended up getting to be president, halted what looked like they were about to be successful Oslo-based negotiations. And the Bush administration made it really clear that they were not interested in this. And then Hamas really got going with a whole devastating series of bombings and attacks, especially on buses and markets. 9/11, Sharon and Arafat become belligerent with each other. And then in the final year or two of his presidency, George W. Bush kind of pivots a little and decides to formally state that the US is in favor of creating a Palestinian state. But this is after the entire Middle East has been shaken and rattled by the Iraq War. Arafat dies in 2004. Mahmoud Abbas becomes president of the Palestinian Authority. I don't want to go through all these bullet points, actually. I want to move us further along. So I'm going to let you see some of these images, and then I'm going to catch us up. And I'm going to get to sort of the bottom line. Actually, I'll stop on this one. What I just zoomed ridiculously through was a whole bunch of political heads of state taking steps that made things worse, and then sometimes taking a step that made it seem like Oslo could be resuscitated, but then somebody else would take steps that would drive further nails into Oslo's coffin. And you're seeing, meanwhile, the confidence in the peace camp in Israeli society lose credibility, and the PLO continue to lose credibility. And as I won't cover the details of how it came to happen, but we also saw the fracturing of governance of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, with Hamas taking over Gaza, or at least the internal control of affairs inside Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority having partial control over that same set of blotches that looked so promising in the beginning because it was growing and you could sort of picture it growing into a contiguous Palestinian state. But now it just looks an awful lot like a bunch of permanent Bantustans. So again, context matters a whole lot in terms of what something means when we look at it. So part of what this period also looks like, and I'm going to zoom through this, in terms of the ratcheting up of violence in whole new ways, the intensity of Israeli bombing that kills Palestinian civilians, regardless of who you believe about how hard Israeli forces try to avoid that, the results are in real life and in body count are devastating. Similarly, Israeli civilians really, really terrified to be in the range of these rockets, and in particular, really fearful about the possibility of these rockets ending up having biological or chemical agents on them. There's a sense among Israelis, especially as groups like Hezbollah have built up over 200,000 rockets in southern Lebanon, that it wouldn't take much to create a massive domestic catastrophe. So all of these are pieces of what leads to the horrible, horrible, never-ending cycles of violence. I am zooming through stuff. We're zooming through the Obama years, remember that. We're zooming through the Israelis putting up the wall and then building the wall in ways that it digs deeper into the West Bank and pulls more West Bank territory out of Palestinian control. I am showing you images of how the pro-Palestinian media tended to include editorial cartoons that depicted Obama as a Palestinian hater, someone in the Jews' pocket, using anti-Semitic imagery of Jews, as in these two cartoons, and in this one. And then on the pro-Israel, pro-Zionist propaganda side, he's an anti-Semite, he's a Jew hater, tear down this wall. So the reason I bothered to show that is because the power of these narratives is that they pull in and attract, like a center of gravity, distortions and extreme depictions of what's going on. So we're almost there. What killed Oslo? Each one of these tiles is one of the many things that helped kill Oslo. One is Jewish religious messianic territorial zealotry, the growth from a fringe movement into the dominant religious belief system for Orthodox Jews, particularly living in the West Bank, helped kill Oslo. The growth and popularity of Hamas, of Islamic Messianic territorial zealotry, of, again, a sort of a religious mandate that says all of this territory for religious reasons must be ruled by these people in this way, and anybody who's standing in the way of that has to be moved aside one way or another. Some people argue the failure by political leaders to involve religious leaders was one of the things that killed Oslo. I can say more about that another time. The movement called Christians United for Israel and some of its cousin organizations, the rise and growth and domination of those movements, of a lot of the lobbying space. Christians United for Israel is a much larger lobby than AIPAC, and it has something like 30 million supporters. AIPAC has something like 100,000. There's no comparison. And for these folks, they have embraced a variety of different belief systems. They're not all the same, and it's not all of them are subscribed to the idea that the Jews need to all move to Israel so Jesus can return. Some of them believe that, not all of them believe it, but what they all share in common is a commitment to a deep opposition to anything like the Oslo Agreement getting a chance to play itself out. It's an all or nothing kind of approach. Corruption in the Palestinian Authority and the PLO helped kill Oslo. I told you a lot of money flowed in. A lot of money did flow in. Unfortunately, one of the most corrupt people ever to head a major national liberation movement was Yasser Arafat. He died with something like $500 million in the bank in untraceable accounts in Europe. While he was president of the Palestinian Authority, there was not one school or hospital that was built in any of the territory. Abbas, his successor, much less corrupt. They've built hospitals, they've built schools, they even built an entirely new city. But the corruption was systemic, overwhelming, and it demoralized rank and file Palestinians, and it helped empower groups like Hamas. What else killed Oslo? For 5 years, the Bush administration was not interested and instead wanted to remake Iraq. That really hurt. The two sides were pretty darn close to hammering out their differences and making an agreement in 2001. I think that Iran's long-term work to keep arming Hezbollah, the militant group that now dominates southern Lebanon, and providing them in particular with rockets, is something that has caused rank and file Israelis to become incredibly frightened and unsympathetic to taking any kind of risk in order to reach a peace agreement. So I think that helped kill Oslo. Having one side fall into conflict in a way that led to the separation of Gaza and the West Bank helped kill Oslo. The Palestinian Authority's failure to quell incitement helped kill Oslo. It was an opportunity to build confidence that got missed. The Israeli settlements expansion and the radicalization of more and more of the settlers killed Oslo. And by the way, I'm not suggesting each of these tiles carries equal weight. I'm in my mind, this is possibly number one on the list. A growing number of activists, Israeli and Palestinian activists, are making the case that the failure to involve women, except only occasionally, at all levels of diplomacy and negotiation is one of the reasons that Oslo didn't work. I think that is a deeply important and fascinating line of concern to pursue. I can't unpack it further because of our time constraint, but I wanted to name it. I'm a big fan of parliamentary democracy and democracy in general. hoping I still live in a country that has a stable democracy, or at least a democracy on life support. Israel's incredibly fractious and unstable parliamentary democracy is one of the things that hasn't helped give Oslo a chance. I'm not saying I wish they had a dictator instead. I'm saying when your government changes 7 times in 9 years, between people who have very different ideas about whether or not they want this agreement to work, if I'm on the Palestinian governance side of things, I'm like, who am I talking to and what do they want? I don't even know. The unending re-traumatizing of both peoples helped kill Oslo. The catastrophic civil war and collapse of Syria has actually helped kill Oslo, and in a number of different ways. One is that it has unleashed massive new refugee catastrophes and crises that in some ways have taken the eyes of the world off of the plight of Palestinian refugees. And that has in some ways, I think, cost the Palestinians some of the support and intensity of support that they could previously count on from parts of the Arab world. The other thing is that it's freaked Israelis out. There are a lot of rank and file Israelis who see this unbelievable disaster that has engulfed civilians and killed civilians by the tens of thousands, sometimes just in the matter of days by the tens of thousands, in their neighbor to the northeast. And something that may be hard for us to get in North America is that when that's happening in the province next door, in the state next door, and it's happening in a context of several other states just went through political upheavals and convulsions, the impact on a lot of people is basically like, oh my God, you know what? I feel risk averse right now. In fact, the status quo is kind of okay with me right now because I don't want anything like that to be happening here. And I'm not saying it would, but I could imagine maybe it could, or maybe they couldn't have imagined that it could, and then it did. And I just want to name that's something I've learned listening to people talk about the impacts. So what now? Final couple minutes here. There are a number of different possible directions forward. I am presenting them in a somewhat values neutral way. So, starting in the upper left, one is endless occupation. One path forward that might play out is that Israel will go ahead in one way or another and keep annexing parts of the West Bank. The Israeli government is doing that in a de facto way, but also, as we know, last summer announced in a strong desire to also do it in a legal way, in a de jure way, which is where you make it official, right? So one path forward that some people especially on the Zionist side of this thing, kind of are okay with is just for the status quo to carry on. Number two, there are folks who are hoping that there's a chance to go back to Oslo and try to make it work again. Why? They're pinning their hopes to Trump losing and Biden winning. It's a very slim thing to pin it to. That's not a comment on the Biden administration. I have no clue what their policy is going to actually shake out to be. They are intensely focused on the enormous domestic policy crises that are happening here, and I don't think we actually know yet. But my point is just, it's a thin thing to pin it to. There is no longer a large, solid majority constituency in Israel or in Palestine that believes Oslo-style two states will happen anytime soon. There may be majorities, if you poll them, who will say that they prefer something like that as a final status agreement. But in terms of people who think it could happen, the folks who are, let's put it this way, who would feel motivated to take risks for it to happen is really, really small. And there's really very little incentive for whomever is going to emerge from the latest Israeli election to do much to try to make this thing work. And yet, a lot of the people who are saying this is still the plan to work towards are people who are arguing, number one, there aren't any other better alternatives. Number two, maybe people who are giving up have too short a view of history, that they're pointing out that sometimes it takes decades and decades to finally get to an arrangement that people said wasn't going to work for a long time. Okay, number three, what I'm calling Israelstein with tongue in cheek, but I don't mean that in a way that is meant to be making fun. Number three is some kind of single state solution, a fusion of the two national groups, a single binational state in all of the land with equal rights and freedom of movement for all. That is a solution that is incredible, that is gaining traction and support among younger Palestinians. And parts of the Jewish Israeli left that have come to feel demoralized about the viability of a two-state solution are also now taking an interest in this option. The next one, confederation, is probably getting a lot of chatter in diplomatic classes right now, maybe more so than anything else. Confederation is kind of a blend of Oslo's vision of two completely independent nation states. It's kind of a blend of that and a single binational democratic state. And there are many different variations of confederation. I'm not going to unpack all of that here, but basically to have a confederation, you have a government of some sort that's kind of in rules over certain aspects of things for both states that are part of the confederation. But there are other things that are locally governed by the two separate states, but the physical barriers to things like freedom of movement, the different sets of laws and rights governing Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, that all disappears in confederation. And the vision is one of open borders and of it relies on a lot of cooperation. This next one is a really interesting idea that developed in the last 10 years or so. It has a small but growing cadre of supporters among both Israeli and Palestinian political scientists and activists. And it's called Two States in One Place. Basically, the idea is all of the land is open to everyone. There's really only one political set of borders and boundaries. But everybody who is a citizen in this one place gets to pick, do you want to be a citizen of Israel or of Palestine? And you can live wherever you want. So what's appealing about this, and some people think this might have more of a chance of actually gaining traction, is there's actually a chunk of the Jewish Messianic passionate, zealous settler folks who are okay with this. Because for them, they just want Jews to be able to have the ability to live anywhere in the historical land of Israel. Some of those folks don't have any problem with Palestinians also being able to live in Tel Aviv or anywhere else, and are also open to the idea of Palestinian immigration being able to open back up. So, this is an interesting creative concept. Okay, this next one is a very dark possibility. This is the term that the far right in Israel uses. Transfer is what they call it. This is a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. This is a growing minority within the Israeli political right that unfortunately has just garnered 5 or 6 seats in this latest election, and they aren't necessarily going to be in the government because we don't know what kind of government there will be, but it looks like there's a better than 50-50 chance that some of them will be in the government. And they openly advocate for ethnic cleansing of all of Israel and of the occupied territories. And they are very frightening to me. So this final question about like what's next or how might groups move forward is an approach some people might call civil rights first. So there's a growing grassroots movement, especially among younger Palestinians. And this has also gained a lot of popularity among Palestinians living in the diaspora, Palestinian intellectuals and political activists living in places like Canada and the US. But it also has some homegrown support. The idea is let's not get caught up in trying to figure out what the best final status agreement looks like. Instead, let's throw all of our energy behind and on a large scale effort for everybody who lives under Israeli rule to have the same individual and civil rights. And in this idea is that who lives under Israeli rule is defined as anybody who lives anywhere where the ultimate authority, the ultimate actor who can actually use power to make things happen is Israel. So that would include people, for example, living in Gaza, who people living in Gaza very much are aware that they are living under Hamas's immediate authority, and yet Israel has the ultimate military control and authority over who can come in and out of Gaza, etc. So the idea is a civil rights movement. Many of the Palestinians who are advocating for this are also quite passionate about using nonviolent organizing methods. And they're basically saying, you know, who knows what the best political arrangement is? Let's speak the language of equal rights and civil rights for everyone living under Israeli rule, and let's do nonviolent disruptive organizing until we are able to achieve that goal. And they're basically saying what happens after that, we don't know, and to say you know for sure which political formula is the one that will work the best and be the fairest is to say something you can't actually know because nobody knows. So let's just focus on what's right in front of us. So those are sort of the competing visions for what next. And now I'm going to stop talking. Thank you for listening to me go on for 90 plus minutes. I'm working on making this thing fit, but would love to hear what some folks might want to share. And I'm going to come out of the screen share.